And we're live. Hello, friends. Mariah is here already. How wonderful. I couldn't respond. I had a messenger that someone else was joining right away. So that's exciting. I think this is an interesting topic today. Welcome to Open Studio with Kim Jorgensen Gane. This is episode, I believe, 7, of my Triggered by Trumpism series, wherein I ask the question, what have you started that's badass? And I'm super excited about my guest today. Ali Khaleel is a board member in the education area with Men4Choice. He's had the opportunity to teach and work in schools in Madison, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and now Chicago. His current role is as the assistant director of the EDGE program, a career skills program run through the Career Center at DePaul University. And for the past several years, which is why we're talking to him today, Ali has worked on issues of masculinity and manhood, specifically how we can educate young men to live a life of healthier masculinity, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. I have two 17-year-old boys in my house. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Ali in. I'm always so excited when this works. And there he is.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. It's so nice to meet you, Ali, and I thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, you too. Nice to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Doing well, doing well.
I have to say this has actually helped, doing these Facebook Lives on Fridays, having, something to kind of look forward to, a reason to do hair and makeup.
Yeah.
Kind of, maybe it'll give my husband a reason to take me on a car date or something.
There you go. There you go.
Whatever.
Yep.
So how are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a lot of adjustment for everybody, but thankfully I'm healthy. My family is doing all right. Yeah, all things considered, great.
Glad to hear it. Yeah, we've been lucky too. Our family is healthy. Our loved ones have managed to stay healthy. My husband's work is essential, and he was, until this week, able to do it from home. So
great.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of your work can be done remotely, I imagine, although I'm sure face-to-face is, when you're working with students. I know that my boys, I live with two 17-year-old boys and one almost 60-year-old one.
There you go. We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we do. We have a lot to talk about, indeed. So I know that my boys have really struggled with adapting to the online, my son particularly. He's just having a really hard time feeling engaged. He's, I think, struggling with some depression. So, it's rough out there.
Yeah, I think that a lot of students, especially young men, are feeling that way, and the more they can talk about it, it can be so helpful just to have a safe environment to express some of those feelings. I know a lot of the young guys around in my program are not, feeling like they can talk to too many people. Even in the program that I run at DePaul, I have about 15 students I oversee directly, freshmen that I meet with, and I think that there's so much value in just that face-to-face interaction, even though it's virtual, just to have someone outside of your home to talk to as well.
Yes.
But knowing that this programming is just not built to be done virtually, and everyone is just triaging at this point. Yeah. We're doing our best, but know that it's not a...
Yeah, our schools were totally unprepared to deal with this.
Yeah.
And to, and really, I think that they're doing as good a job as can be expected, under the circumstances. Certainly, my concerns are around kids who don't have access to the internet. And I know that, our school has tried its best to solve that problem. But it, I guess it goes to the topic of, and, this is a great place for us to start probably, is that not, sheltering at home is a privilege, and not all homes are safe. either for their female occupants or their minor occupants or, any of the occupants. And I know that a lot of I've been a mom since I was 20 years old. I raised my daughter alone for the first 6 years of her life. I've raised a generation of girls, my daughter and my stepdaughter, and now a generation of boys, our son, and we have guardianship of our nephew. They're both 17. And I'm a 2-time sexual assault survivor. And I produced and co-directed a show called Listen to Your Mother. And one of the stories that I told was called Trigger Warning, Mothering Boys. Mm. And it was about mothering teenage boys as a sexual assault survivor. And that's hard.
Yeah.
Because as a mom, I don't want to make my boys feel bad for being boys. I love my boys. I'm writing a book called Mother Feminist, Raising Ourselves and the Men We Fall For. And it's a love story because I love my girls. I love my boys. I love my husband. I love my sons-in-law. There isn't anyone in my family I want less for. So I want to find ways to talk about these things, that don't accuse and I think that I can personally get a lot better at that. So that's what I'm hoping maybe you can help me with today.
Yeah. I think just to start, I'm not a parent, but I have a mom, and I am from a family full of boys. I grew up as the youngest of 4 brothers. My poor mother is the common refrain I get when I tell them that.
Yes, I was thinking that, but I didn't want to say it.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of my work in masculinity, I didn't realize it until I'd gotten started in it a few years ago, but a lot of it is because of the way that my mom raised us. And I think more than anything, she just made it okay to feel however we were feeling. She never told us to stop crying. She never told us to not lose our temper. She just let it happen, and it was just there. Whenever you're ready, I'm here to talk about it.
Wow. You had an exceptional mother.
100%. And I'm forever grateful for the example that she set for the type of men that we are. And, to her credit, she was an only child. So it's not like she grew up with younger brothers or anybody like that. But it was just that was the type of parenting that I think she felt was the best for a group full of boys. And I think there was also the layer that I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, she moved from India with my dad after they got married, moved to the United States, didn't know anybody. And my mom knew that raising a house full of brown boys, she needed us to, be emotionally mature. Because especially in the aftermath of 9/11, that we were going to be seen a certain way. Growing up Muslim, my mom wears a headscarf, that we needed to be emotionally mature and be able to regulate our emotions. And the only way that we were going to be able to do that is that if we had a safe space where we didn't have to regulate our emotions.
Right.
So we knew how to switch when we left the house.
Wow. That is a lot. That is, I have friends who have Black sons, and in the Listen to Your Mother show that I produced and co-directed, so Michigan is a very segregated state. We really are. And my county is an extreme example of that. Benton Harbor is across the river. We're called the Twin Cities. But Benton Harbor is approximately 90% Black and socioeconomically depressed. And St. Joe is approximately 90% white and affluent. And, our Benton Harbor schools have been at risk of closure. Our St. Joe schools seem to have unlimited resources. So, when I did the show, it was to bring my communities together through the stories of motherhood. So one of the stories that we featured was at the time, a woman who's become a friend now, of course. She was at the time the executive director of Emergency Shelter Services, which was the charity that we were donating to with a portion of our ticket sales. And her story was about, I was raised with a sister, I had a mother, I had a daughter first, and now all of a sudden I think her son was 3 at the time. I have this little Black boy who I am afraid of sending out into the world. And that's not something I'm equipped to deal with because I've been raised with girls.
Yeah.
So
there is that added layer of, preparing. And I think it goes for girls too, preparing them for the way that society is going to see them. And knowing that that child better than other people, but know that other people might not care to get to know them as much before they judge them. And unfortunately, you're sort of cultivating a sense of a public-facing persona in your child, so that they are able to cut through some of those prejudice, some of those biases that people might have based on stereotypes.
Yeah. But it isn't really giving them a lot of permission to express their anger, for instance. If they're always going to be the one pulled into the principal's office, or they're always going to be the one pulled out of the car, or, whatever. It's interesting that this is kind of right where we hit, off the bat, because I attended a Brave Talk training, which is race relations related. And in that Brave Talk, I circled it, came out of it with this one statement that has really been my North Star ever since. And that is, we cannot hope to achieve gender equity without first healing racism. And understanding that there is such a relationship between my experience being where I'm from of unhealthy masculinity and racism, that it's hard to talk about, it is, that's the hardest story that I have ever told, is a story about me as a restaurant owner 20 years ago, making a terrible racist Karen kind of mistake, with one of my customers. And I got immense grace, I was terrified of losing friends over this admission, but we have to start from somewhere, and we have to have these conversations. And I think, raising girls and then raising boys, I get how hard it is to be a girl, because I was one and I raised girls, and I'm really deeply familiar with that. But what has come to, what has really been illuminated for me as I'm raising boys is that it's not any easier. It just pays better.
Right. It appears to pay better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Where on its face, it appears that men are, positioned to benefit from the patriarchy, and positioned to benefit from a misogynistic society. There's this bell hooks quote that comes to mind. And I think whenever I talk about masculinity, I often start with this. Your guest a few weeks ago, Oren, who I know well, one of our first conversations about masculinity, I shared this bell hooks quote, and I pulled it up because I just wanted to make sure that we talked about it. So she wrote in her book, The Will to Change, the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence toward women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves.
Oh.
And so you're paying the price. You're saying, okay, this is the cost of adhering to patriarchal mindsets and misogynistic mindsets, is that you are basically giving up an entire segment of your emotional self.
Right.
And
it's that a pussy is the worst thing in the world that any man could ever be.
Yep.
And so feminine, and they pay for that like their entire lives, in locker rooms, on the playground, on the bus.
Yeah.
Wow. And it shuts off such a piece of their humanity that it doesn't, when they can't recognize that humanity in themselves, they can't recognize that humanity in others.
Right. And I think that it's no surprise then that 97% of mass shootings are committed by men, that the only emotion that is acceptable as you grow up as a man is anger.
Or love.
Right. It's if you're sad, you get angry. If you're scared, you act out in anger. All of those emotions are supposed to be channeled towards some sort of expression of anger, either towards other people or towards yourself.
Yeah. It's really mind-blowing. I am in writing my book. I'm trying to recall things from my childhood, and I'm trying to write about my dad and my brother. And these are people, that's why I call it a love story. These are people who I love dearly. But their relationship with, I don't even know how to say this. I haven't figured it out yet, actually. I'm trying to write from a place of compassion and from a place of love, for all the men that I love. My husband is this very evolved guy, for an almost 60-year-old man. But he was a paramedic. He was a firefighter, paramedic, police officer, and Eagle Scout. So, they don't get much more American golden boy, than that. And he managed to be an academic, scholar. But he delivered 17 babies, and he grew up with sisters. And and then, of course, raising our daughters. And I feel like maybe it was the delivering babies, I don't know, that, somehow made him more open. Maybe it was being raised with a sister who had cerebral palsy. Maybe that was what kept his heart, at the center of everything. Oren said something when we were on together, and this was, of course, in talking about Men4Choice and approaching men on the reproductive justice issue and how they can, be a part of that conversation. He said most men don't actually know what harm is created, understand pro-choice. They understand pro-choice on the surface, but have no idea of the outcome of policy and the harm that's created from that policy. He said something about that it's in men's DNA, this paternalistic protectionism, and to tap into that righteous anger and guide it in a way that doesn't recreate the patriarchal framework. And he's like, there's a desire men have to protect their people, and that's not a bad thing. But it's about channeling it in healthy ways.
Yeah, and I think that he's absolutely right. And I think that this is part of the reason why when I talk about masculinity with young men from rural parts of Wisconsin, I start from a place that isn't attacking.
Mm-hmm.
It's inviting. Let's have a conversation about how to broaden our understanding of masculinity. That protection doesn't exclude vulnerability. Right. And brave and sort of emotionally honest behavior. That you can still be protective of others and show vulnerability at the same time. Bravery or protection doesn't necessitate stoicism at all times.
Sure.
That you can be protective in a way that also allows you to be vulnerable. Because there are positive things about what I call traditional masculinity. Mm-hmm. It's just about broadening it so that you don't always feel like you have to protect. That there are some times where you can take a step back and feel protected by others, including women in your life.
So the most difficult thing that I have observed in my growing up is that there's such a connection with violence. What you were talking about with mass shooters and it is that we saw it here at our Capitol in Michigan with the guys with guns threatening grave bodily harm to our governor and our legislators for not letting them live free or die. That tendency towards violence to enforce the patriarchy. And how, I guess maybe we should start by defining patriarchy. How would you define patriarchy?
I would define patriarchy in its broadest terms, which is a system that benefits male identifying people at the expense of everyone else, including women. A society where traditionally male characteristics are seen as the preferred characteristics of leaders and of those who control all the levers of power.
Yeah. And access to those.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when you saw the racial makeup, certainly, and the gender makeup of the most of the people, who were standing on Capitol steps across the country, wearing AR-15s and things, what, like from your training and from your area of interest in this, healthy masculinity, like what goes through your mind? How do you seek to solve that? And
yeah. So I think the first thing that came through my mind when I saw those armed protesters was just how scared they must feel.
Yeah.
That this is fear acting out as anger, and that they're afraid for the livelihood of their families. The economic trauma that this is having on people across the country is super real. Yeah. And I would never want to discount that. But when that fear gets channeled into anger towards this thing that you can't really channel anger towards, it's a virus, but they're looking at, okay, who can we channel our anger towards? Because anger is all we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Anger is what we have. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the Governor Whitmer is an incredible leader, but she's also a woman, which makes it even easier to direct their ire towards a woman leader who is, just by existing as who she is dismantling patriarchy.
Right.
And it adds this layer that, like, this woman is telling us what we can and can't do. She's trying to control us when that's just not the way it's supposed to be.
Right. Which spikes every boy, particularly who was, pulled into a female principal's office, every boy who struggled with female teachers, women have been the gatekeepers, and it's hard, in education. I have, my girls didn't do all that great in school either, frankly, but the environment of learning that has developed, and that has largely been developed by women, is not real suitable to the way boys learn. They tend to be more hands-on. They tend to be more active learners. And to sit still for 8 hours a day, and just have information spit at you, basically, it's a recipe for boys, I think, to be frustrated.
And I've had some incredible mentors when I was coming up as a teacher. And I think that one of the most helpful things for them to remind me was when students misbehave in class, that's not the classroom. There's something else going on. It's usually non-classroom related issues that are being projected into the room. Sometimes that means that they actually feel safe enough to express themselves in the classroom, even though it might come out as disruptive behavior. Right. It's actually a testament to the safety and the environment that teacher has created. And I think the other thing is these boys oftentimes, but girls too, everybody, we just need to know that the classroom is a safe place to channel our energy.
Yeah.
I see, in my classroom when students would act out, especially young men, it was figuring out how can I channel that really awesome energy in a more productive way. Yeah. You are talking to all of your classmates, getting all of them off topic. Okay, how can I have you talk to the entire class in a relevant discussion about what we're teaching? It's all about using the potential that already exists within that child in a way that's channeled. And I think that requires, and this is something that teachers have a hard time with. I spent a couple summers supervising college students who were interested in becoming educators. And one of the hardest things for them to do is to relinquish some of that control. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when we sort of move away from that information banking model of education, where we're just sort of treating students as a receptacle into which we put knowledge, we're relinquishing some of that control. And I think it's in those environments that our boys can really, really thrive when they're able to have some power over their own learning. And I think everybody thrives when they're able to learn from people that are not just the teacher in the room.
Oh, yeah. That's really interesting. And that, maybe that is kind of an opportunity that we have now with, the way that our kids are being educated, for the end of the school year. Maybe, my son particularly, as I said, is struggling with this. Maybe that's a way to encourage him, as you get to really kind of develop a one-on-one relationship with your teachers, and, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship building is really important. And I think that just giving our young people of all gender identities a place where it feels okay to express the full range of who they are.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to the gender identities label, can you explain for everyone kind of, that, are you familiar with the genderbread man?
Yes.
Okay.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, likewise. So just, my understanding is, so there's G.I. Joe on one end of the spectrum and there's Barbie on the other. And this is something I totally understand as a child of the 70s, and that gender is a spectrum, and that all things along that spectrum, regardless of your assigned at birth gender, are normal expressions of gender. So how do you like broach that topic with the young men that you work for in a healthy masculinity way?
Yeah, so I think that, like you said, a lot of men are raised, especially in the environments where I grew up. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and the men that I work with there, it's that G.I. Joe side of the spectrum. That is, real man. When someone says be a man, they're talking about G.I. Joe.
Right.
And I approach it, again, not from a place of attacking or insulting, because oftentimes if you do that, it's seen as an assault or an indictment on the men that raised them. Their father, their uncle, the men in their life who may have instilled some of those harmful versions of masculinity, but that doesn't mean that person isn't also a great role model in other ways. Sure. So I think it's really important to approach it in a delicate manner, because more than anything, I'm interested in having the conversation. So I'm going to approach it in a way that people still want to have the conversation with me. But I approach it from a point of self-determination. That when we put men in that box where we say, this is the only way that you are allowed to function, we are not letting them be who they are. If you want to drive a truck and go hunting, do that, but make sure that it's what you want to do. Right. And it's not because you are blindly adhering to the notions of masculinity that you were raised to believe are the only acceptable expression of what a man is. And so explore, step outside of that box, explore other ways of living. And if you decide that hunting is a hobby that you enjoy for whatever reason, not something that I like to do, but if you like that, absolutely do that. But make sure that it's something that you enjoy doing. And on that note, make sure that you're allowing the men in your life to explore that as well. Because I think one of the core tenets of traditional unhealthy masculinity is policing other men.
Right.
Is bullying other men, is where that locker room talk comes in. It's where, your whole self-worth is based on your ability to dominate other men. And I think it's important to explore on our own and also create space for the other men in our lives to explore by just being ourselves and exploring on our own and showing that example and that being that role model, and also just using that encouraging behavior and being a good friend who cares about the people in your life being a full range of themselves.
That's really great. A big theme in our family when I was young, was you got to learn how to take a punch, and being rough with little people. And I know that wasn't the healthiest thing now, but back then it was just normal. How do we generationally help people of all ages, understand that the same things harmed them, that because what you just said about, someone's father, and that's the way that they were raised. I mean, that really resonates with me, especially in trying to, write my book and do it in a way that that I don't lose the relationships that I value, in my life. And that I don't lose, the people that I love, because we're already in a hard enough environment, right now to keep those relationships healthy. So generationally, how do we talk to the older generations about this in a way that have you mastered that? Because I know you work largely with young people.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It is, it's tough. I've had this conversation with my own dad, who's, in his 70s, grew up in India, in a very, patriarchal culture, about this. And I think that one of the most important questions that I asked my dad was, are you happy with the way that you were raised and your understanding of what a man is? And my dad has had his struggles. He's lost jobs. He's had really tough time, moving to the United States and going through these struggles. And I think one of the things that he often talks about is he didn't want to police our behavior the way that his dad policed his, because he knows that there were decisions in his life that he made because he was afraid of failing. And I think that, again, somebody who does not have kids, but, I have nephews and I have, older brothers, who is a parent. And I think it's just about, do you want your son, your children to be raised the way that you were? And some might say yes, but I think it's also important to recognize that it's okay to change, because society is also changing, and it's important that we understand that you're not raising your son in the same world that you grew up in.
Oh yeah, very true.
And the whole thing is about survival, right? You want your child to be able to thrive and survive in the world as they're growing up in it. And it's important to realize that we don't live in that world. And if you are trying to go back to that world, as some men are, including our president, that you are doing your children a disservice, and you're also doing other people's children a disservice.
Sure.
Who are disenfranchised by that society. And I think that it's about evolving.
Yeah. Yeah. You bring up a really good, so I'm familiar with Mark Green.
Yes. It's a great book.
Excellent author, real great thinker, in this area of toxic masculinity. And I was trying not to use that word because it's such an accusatory word, I was trying to talk about healthy and unhealthy masculinity, and I ruined it for myself. Well, I'm evolving too.
Exactly.
So I gave my dad a copy of this book for Christmas, and his response was, "Oh yeah, I already knew all that stuff." And yet my copy is, highlighted, marked up, and I also gave him this book, which this book is, holy cow, How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, From Welfare Reform to Foreclosure to Trump, Professor Laura Briggs. This is mind-blowing. Again, I have, I'm having a hard time, marked up. And it's research for me. So when you talk about generations and wanting to go back to the way things were, and we look at that from the Me Too, with the Me Too movement and Time's Up and all of that. And we are raising boys and girls who will become bosses, some of them someday. And, when we look at kind of how the Me Too movement came to be and how related it is to this presidency and how much of a response it is to this presidency and his administration's attack, not just on women, but on people of color, on the LGBT community, that you're absolutely right. We are doing future generations a disservice because the Me Too movement now has sprung. It's never going to go away. and men and women functioning together in workspaces, that is, there's no turning that off, as much as they try to take us out of the workforce by, limiting our reproductive rights, or, paying us, no maternal, maternity leave, paid maternity leave, no paid child, there are a lot of ways that they're trying to take women out of the workforce and really take us out of the economy and everything. That's a pretty critical, piece to our success as a country.
Yeah, and I think that, in addition to, like, in terms of bringing men into a sort of more progressive version of masculinity, and sort of reimagining how we define ourselves as men, it's important for us to keep in mind the way that it benefits women, not even just the women in our lives, but just women in general, all people. We should be fighting for equitable opportunities for all people. But it's also so important to emphasize the benefits this has for men. That we move away from this version of masculinity where our self-worth is defined by our ability to dominate and protect. Men die by suicide at 3.5 times the rate of women.
Yeah,
it's not a coincidence. When you look at when you cross gender and race, white men made up 70% of deaths by suicide in 2017.
Wow.
These are not, surprising statistics. And it's really important for us to understand that men stand as much to gain from dismantling misogyny and patriarchy as anyone else does.
Mm.
You have to look below the surface to see it. That these core tenets of masculinity are inherently correct in their foundation. And we're going to continue to inflict violence on ourselves and others until we reimagine our entire understanding of what it means to be a man. And everyone stands to gain from that.
Yeah.
Not just women.
Ooh, that was a really heavy, that is the truth. When you talk about the suicide rate, I was suicidal as a young single mom. That was my first listen to your mother's story, was about, and it was because I felt every day like I was failing my daughter. And when we hold, I have now become aware of the stereotypes, that when we hold people to these unrealistic stereotypes, whether it's men, women, any of us, there's nothing for us to do but fall off those pedestals, those unrealistic pedestals. And so every day I was falling off that pedestal, whether it was because I couldn't pay my electric bill, or I had to choose, am I paying the gas bill or the electric bill? What am I closest to being shut off? And also, my husband has been downsized twice, white man of a certain age in corporate America. And the second time, we had been in California for 2 years in San Diego. And when we moved back, they had, really in an ugly way ended his position. And it was all money. They brought him in to fix all the infrastructure stuff. Excuse me. And then once he got everything, they got to their baseline where they weren't at risk of losing their government contracts anymore. Then they wanted to have someone else just at half his salary, come in and just maintain. So it was through no fault of his, but they made him feel like it was something he had done wrong. And we came back to Michigan from San Diego, moved into a house that we didn't even get to see before we, a rental house. And my husband was, I think, suicidal after that experience. And it was because he's set up, to hold the world on his shoulders, right? And be responsible for, the entire family. Our daughters were, just launching into their lives. And, he's literally holding up the world and feeling like he was a failure. So I have real personal experience with, suicidal ideation and living beside it. And with two 17-year-old boys in my house now, at a very difficult time in our history, unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. And I think that the suicide rates are going to be devastating in this.
I mean, we're already seeing it with domestic violence rates around the world going up. I think France reported a 30% increase in the use of domestic violence prevention services. The Washington Post just had an article today about, or the New York Times rather, had an article today about domestic violence calls increasing across the country. It's a matter of time before our inability, especially with men, our inability to emote or our unwillingness to emote is going to just ravage the country, both towards ourselves and towards other people, given the circumstances. I'm reminded of the story that I tell sometimes about the reason I got interested in this work initially. About 5 years ago, I was in my first year teaching. It was a high school. I was a ninth grade history teacher on the west side of Chicago.
Wow.
And I was ninth graders. They're 14, 15 years old. A lot of things are going on. They smell pretty bad. But one of the things, that's sort of a staple of that age for a lot of young people, especially in the United States, is that they're experimenting with relationships for the first time.
Sure.
A lot of them are entering into romantic relationships. And, as you can imagine, I had a lot of couples in my classes. And there were these two couples who, it was clear that they were dating. They would walk each other to my room when either one of them had class with me. And then it was very clear when they broke up. When both of these relationships ended, as ninth grade relationships tend to do, they end. And there was something really bizarre. It was because they happened at the same time that I think I was able to see the parallels. The two girls who had been in these relationships that had just ended, they were with their friends a lot more. They wanted to sit by each other. They were clearly talking and comforting the young woman who had been in the relationship that ended. And the boys, who were both fairly outgoing, completely closed in on themselves. They weren't talking. It was clear that they were going through something, but they weren't willing to talk to anybody. Even when I asked them, "Hey, how are you doing?" Try to keep them after class to ask them how they were doing. They just didn't want to talk. And then within about a month of each other, we found out that both of the boys had tried to harm themselves and were placed on a mandatory watch at the hospital. At risk of, because they were having suicidal ideations.
Oh my God.
And it happened within a month of each other. One was 14, one was 15 at the time. And it just, when you experience something like that as a young teacher, it really breaks something in you. And
opens, right?
Opens, right? The breaking sort of creates an opening for something new. And I think that really put me on this path to understanding why would the reactions to a relationship ending so different by gender, so drastically different in how they handled it. And thankfully, both boys are still with us today. But how did it get that far? And it set me on this path towards understanding how we can get boys to a place where they do feel like they can confide in their friends and other people if they experience something like that. Because even from a young age, they weren't able to do that. And so I can't even imagine, other men who are much older who have continued to adhere to those versions of masculinity where you're not really able to emote. It can lead to later in life.
Yeah, I think it's really about community, and boys tend to only have community in sports or, things like that, things that boys do or are supposed to do. And I think, that's really kind of with my nephew. He doesn't have the words even for emotions other than, really for any emotions. I'm good. I'm fine. There's not, and that's what he's going to therapy and, working on those things and ways to express himself and ways to be in relationship with people. And my son, it's, I think that we have not been as mindful of his mental health, thinking that he had such a good foundation. And now this, what's happening now is bringing up, I think, his lack of community and, missing. He has some anxiety, and he was just starting to, get out there and have some experiences with friends, and, having wheels, certainly, but it's, I think the loneliness and the lack of community is.
It reminds me that I think one of the greatest myths of masculinity is that it's supposed to be done alone.
Yeah.
That and any community that we have, like you mentioned, sports has such a intense patriarchy and pecking order.
Yeah.
That is sort of inherent to that kind of activity, and that the people at the top are the ones who are the strongest physically, the ability to dominate. And so even the one community where it does feel safe to be yourself, your position is defined by your physical ability.
Yeah.
And that's so unfair.
It is.
And it's just so destructive. And I think that, I think the one thing that we can all do is just continue to create those spaces and try to encourage our young men that that's not the only way to be, but knowing that. And I think it's also important for them to be able to read those interactions for what they are.
Yeah.
You have friends who are going to adhere to that traditional form of masculinity. It doesn't mean that you should write them off, but try to read the subtext in what your friends are saying. Try to be that friend who is emotionally honest and more open, but be there for your friends, because you can tell, I tell my family members, my male family members, that I love them all the time. I say, I love you. And they rarely say it back. One of them even, in jest gives me the middle finger sometimes when I say it. But, I'm not saying it because I want him to say it back.
Yeah.
I'm saying it because that's an expression of my gratitude towards him.
Right.
And that's what it is. It's creating a space for them to be themselves. And so with our young men, whether it's their parent, their uncles, or their friends, it's just creating that environment where it feels okay to be themselves. And I think it's also really important for our sports coaches, the men who lead, who are in those positions of power, to understand this work.
Yeah.
There's some great athletes out there who are starting to do some of this work. And I think that's one of the most encouraging things about it. Our college athletics, our professional athletics, those leaders need to be a part of this conversation because they have such an incredible opportunity to start to broaden our understanding of masculinity.
Yeah. Jackson Katz is another author and scholar whose work I just find fascinating. I purchased a film, Bystander, something about bystander. Anyways, my conversation with my boys has always been about not being just a bystander who just stands by and lets things happen, but being someone who doesn't stand for, things when you see something happening that's wrong, but to not respond to violence with violence, for instance, but, just tug on a friend's sleeve and say, hey man, not cool. Let's just go, or whatever. I mean, that's really the extent of my wisdom that I have, tried to share. But one of the things that I have observed is the impulse that I think a lot of men have, that they are supposed to have all the answers, and to not invite particularly female insight, into the conversation, and the pressure on them to have all the answers and to know what to do just magically, but they are inherently gifted with,
Yeah. I think there is a study done, I think maybe a couple of years ago, that said that the average man will drive an unnecessary 276 miles a year because they don't ask for directions. I remember road trips with my dad as a kid, telling my mom, like, I don't need directions, but it was very clear that he did.
Right.
We could have gone to our aunt's house so much sooner.
Yeah.
If we had just asked for directions.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's it's so silly when you really think about it, because what are you accomplishing?
Right.
What are you really accomplishing? You're inconveniencing everybody, including yourself.
Yeah.
But I think that it also, seeing ourselves as emotionally full also means seeing other people as, full representations of who they can be. And I think that it starts inward. And that's what we talk about at the camp, at the work that I do with men, is that it has to start by allowing yourself to be a full human being, which means sometimes you have the answer, sometimes you don't. And only then are you able to see other people as a full range of who they are and not just as a manifestation of the stereotypes that we have about those identities. Yeah. And it really has to start inward. I think if that happens, then you are able to see everyone as, able to have the answers, because you see yourself as somebody who sometimes has them, sometimes doesn't.
Right.
And I think it really has to start inward. And I think that that's something that, understandably, men are really afraid to do.
Yeah.
It's no surprise that when I do this work, so I started doing this work at a summer camp in Wisconsin, that brings about 800 17-year-old, 18-year-old boys.
Like a petri dish.
Exactly. It's a petri dish, really is. And it's like a leadership camp. And it's men who are selected to come to this camp. There's a boys state and there's a girl state program, and they're run by the American Legions, this group of old veterans. And it started back in the 40s. It's been going on forever. There's a girl state and a boy state in every state except for Hawaii, I think. And so these men and women, they're at these camps, they're separate, and all the people that come to this camp are selected by their counselors, by their teachers. They're the ones who are excelling in academics, in athletics, their extracurriculars. They're sort of at the top of their classes. And they come to this camp to learn about civic engagement, about leadership, and all of that. And the program that I coordinate there, we call it the Man Box program. And it's one of the first places that these young men feel like they can be their full selves. And they're the ones who are the student council presidents. They're the ones who are the captains of the sports teams. They're the ones who are on a pedestal in their communities, in their schools. We bring them to this camp, the boys and the girls to this camp before their senior year of high school, so they can take what they learn and enact change during their last year of high school. And one of the most impactful things that we do is just allow them to be their full selves. And you would be amazed by how many men just start crying when we ask them about what it means to be a man. And it's because they finally feel safe to be themselves, to really think about, who am I and why am I this way? Do I actually like playing that sport? Or is it something that I was told, if I do it, people will respect me?
Or I'll get to college, or yeah.
It's the only path forward, right? And I think that it's just so important that we allow men to explore those things for themselves and just create more spaces like that.
Yeah.
And not just at the camp. And one of the things that we struggle with most is, we created this petri dish, we created this sort of incubator over these 8 days to explore who you are and who you want to be. Now the difficult part comes when you leave.
Yeah.
And you go and interact with people who didn't have the same experience that you did. How are you going to make sure this is an enduring lesson and not just one that's fixed to this once week during your summer before senior year of high school?
Yeah.
And I think that's so tough. And it's going back to something that I said earlier, but every year that I do this, there's always at least one young man who comes up to me after the program ends and says, hey, I am that guy in my friend group. I am the one who tries to be open with my friends, who tries to call them out when they say something misogynistic, or they're sort of catcalling a girl at the school or something, and they just laugh at me. My friends just laugh at me and they call me, like you said, all those words that are meant to demean men or sort of feminize them as if it's a bad thing.
Right.
And I say, yeah, that's going to happen, and it's going to keep happening. But then one day it's not. You just have to keep working. You have to be that person, because it's just as much benefiting your friends who are seeing that there is another way forward as it is benefiting you, because you are sort of becoming that person no matter who you're around. And it's tough.
It is tough. It's kind of like let your freak flag fly.
Mm-hmm.
and that's but that is a lot harder to do when you're young, than it is when you're older. I get people who, are say to me, they're glad that I speak about what I speak about, and they're glad that I talk about abortion rights ad nauseum, probably some people think, but I'm trying to, make the connections for people about how critical that is to our economic stability. And like when women prosper, our families prosper. Mm-hmm. And the fact that men put up with women making so much less money, women in their families contributing less money, all of these things, it's I guess before, so we have 4 minutes left, actually. This went so fast. Oh my God. Always look forward to, let's see, love the reframing, breaking can bring opening. Yes. Patricia, wow, exact same story with my best friend's sophomore son after his girlfriend broke up. My friend was so distraught that her son couldn't express what he was going through with her. Great guest. And same commenter, my son participated in Boys State in Austin, Texas in 2010. Wonderful. So what are the connections for you in your work? How did your work bring you to Men4Choice? Because that's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So I'd love to end on that note, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So abortion and the desire to restrict a woman's right to choose is a manifestation of misogyny. Mm-hmm. And that's it is, simply put, it is our desire to control women. Kate Mann, who's this philosophy professor at Cornell, has this great book, Logic of Misogyny, and she defines misogyny in much broader terms than we think about it. It's not necessarily a hatred or hostility towards women, but it's a desire to control women who seek to come up against our understanding of patriarchy and reward the women who enforce the status quo.
Yes.
And sort of attack the women who are trying to be full self, be their fullest selves, which includes a right to their own body. And so for me, it's seen as, if you believe in an equitable society, and if you believe that misogyny is harmful, then you should be pro-choice. You should be a supporter of everybody's bodily autonomy, not just women, but for everyone. Because, as Martin Luther King says, no one is free until we're all free. And I think it like you mentioned earlier, it's everyone prospers when women prosper, and people can only prosper if they have control of their own body. Right. And so, I see abortion and a desire to stifle a woman's right as a manifestation of patriarchy and misogyny, because it's one more way that we can control a group of people that are threatening our hold on the patriarchy.
Yeah. Amen, brother. That is a perfect way to end. We are better together. We are better, when we're putting our heads together, and we come up with more innovations and more creative solutions when, everyone is represented at the table. Representation is such a critical piece that's missing, really, in our government and in our ways that, our institutions are run, all of those things. Your voice at the table is so valuable. God bless your mother.
Absolutely.
What a lady. I would love to meet her someday. And I will emulate her to the best of my ability, as in the last time I have with these boys under my roof. And I just thank you so much, Ali, for joining me today. And I mean, it does my heart really great. I'm excited to, are you working on a book by any chance?
I am not. Not at the moment.
Well, thankfully, there are the Mark Greens and the Ducks and Katzes in the world, but I appreciate your voice so much, and I appreciate your time. And this has been Open Studio with Kim Jorgensen Gane. This was episode, I think, 7, 8, I don't remember anymore, of my series Triggered by Trumpism, wherein I asked the question, what have you started that's badass? And Ali, you certainly qualify, and I thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too.